In a dusty, struggling auto shop on the outskirts of a sleepy town, Ethan Hayes, a broke but genuine mechanic, takes a leap of faith when he invites a mysterious and elegant stranger to the cheapest diner in town. Unbeknownst to Ethan, the woman accepting his simple invitation is secretly an heiress with a hidden past and an empire waiting at her fingertips. But when the truth emerges, will their connection be enough to overcome the divide of wealth, secrets, and expectations? Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The sun had already sunk low over the horizon, painting Ethan Hayes' garage in shadows and golden streaks as another grueling day came to an end. Ethan straightened up slowly from the hood of a rusted pickup, rubbing the aching muscles in his neck with grease-stained fingers. He was exhausted, not just from the manual labor that had consumed his day, but from carrying the relentless weight of worry that never seemed to leave him alone. He glanced around the cluttered workshop, a grim reflection of his reality. Half-empty oil drums stood against walls, marked with peeling paint, the cracked concrete floors stained by years of spilled fluids and worn-out dreams. Faded posters of vintage cars he'd once hoped to restore hung limply, their bright promises long forgotten beneath layers of dust. Ethan pulled the crumpled envelope from the back pocket of his worn-out jeans, opening it again even though the words were already burned into his mind. "Final notice," it screamed in bold red letters. His stomach churned uncomfortably. He had until the end of the month, just 2 weeks, to come up with payment, or he'd lose everything he'd ever worked for. He sighed deeply, frustration tightening his chest. Every dollar counted, every job mattered, yet it never seemed enough. Ethan hated feeling helpless, trapped in a cycle of barely scraping by, always teetering on the edge. The garage was more than a business. It was his father's legacy, the only piece of stability he'd ever known, and losing it felt like betraying the memory of the man who had taught him everything he knew about life, engines, and resilience. The sudden ringing of his phone shattered the quiet tension of the moment. Ethan answered, his voice steady, masking the anxiety beneath. "Hayes Auto Repair," he said, forcing warmth into his weary tone. It was another customer needing urgent repairs, another late-night emergency. Ethan glanced toward the door, darkness slowly swallowing the streets outside. He was already beyond tired, but turning down work wasn't a luxury he could afford. Not now. "I'll wait up," Ethan told the caller, resigning himself to another sleepless night beneath the hood of a car. He hung up, took a deep breath, and stared into the deepening twilight. Somehow, he had to find a way through. The soft hum of distant crickets filled the air as Ethan wiped his hands on an oily rag, finally allowing himself a moment of quiet beneath the faint flicker of a single fluorescent bulb. He'd just started thinking about closing up the shop when the unmistakable growl of a high-end engine echoed through the quiet streets outside. Ethan's head snapped up, curiosity sparking in his tired eyes. Moments later, headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the worn-out concrete driveway in front of his garage. Ethan moved closer, shielding his eyes from the bright beams. He wasn't used to seeing vehicles like this around town. A sleek, midnight black Mercedes, the kind of car that whispered luxury and wealth with every turn of its polished wheels. But something was clearly wrong. The usually smooth purr of the engine was uneven, sputtering, as though the vehicle was barely hanging on. Ethan stood up straighter, suddenly alert as the driver's side door opened and a woman stepped out into the soft glow of the street lamp. Even in the dim lighting, he could see she wasn't from around here. Her tailored cream-colored blouse and designer heels looked out of place against the backdrop of the oil-stained concrete and rusted-out tool racks. Her dark hair cascaded neatly over her shoulders, and her posture was poised, radiating confidence and quiet authority. Yet her eyes, large, soulful, almost vulnerable, betrayed something deeper, hidden just beneath the surface. "Looks like you've got trouble," Ethan called gently, stepping out into the open. She turned quickly, startled, before her tense expression softened slightly at his friendly tone. "Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's wrong," she admitted hesitantly, her voice smooth and melodic, yet edged with uncertainty. She glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with her unfamiliar surroundings. Ethan approached slowly, aware of her nervousness. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked gently, hoping to ease her unease. She nodded gratefully, stepping aside. "Please do. It started making strange noises a few miles back, and now it's barely running." Ethan lifted the hood, warmth radiating from the troubled engine beneath his fingertips. He caught a glimpse of her anxious expression, her eyes briefly darting around the dimly lit street as though wary of being seen. He didn't know who she was or why she looked so haunted, but he could sense that whatever had brought her here tonight was more than just car trouble. "Don't worry," Ethan reassured her softly. "We'll get this sorted out." She smiled faintly, visibly relaxing, yet her guarded eyes never quite lost that lingering shadow. Whoever this mysterious woman was, Ethan knew one thing for certain. She carried secrets, and her unexpected arrival was about to change everything. Ethan leaned closer, examining the sleek engine under the soft hum of the garage's overhead lights. The Mercedes was unlike anything he usually handled. Its polished parts and intricate design spoke of careful craftsmanship, far beyond the everyday beat-up sedans and battered pickups he normally saw. He wiped sweat from his brow and straightened, exhaling slowly as Isabel watched him intently from a safe distance, her eyes wide with quiet expectation. "I can get it running enough to last through tonight," Ethan said, glancing up at her with a reassuring smile. "But to really fix it, I'll need a part I don't usually keep around here." Isabel bit her lower lip nervously, clearly unused to situations like these. "How long would that take?" Ethan hesitated, taking a rag from his back pocket to wipe grease from his fingers. "I can get the part tomorrow morning. Until then, it's probably best you don't take this car too far. Is there somewhere nearby you could stay?" A brief shadow crossed Isabel's elegant features, quickly masked by a calm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll figure something out." Ethan studied her carefully for a moment. She looked poised and confident, yet beneath her polished exterior was an undeniable tension, something guarded, uncertain. The thought of leaving her alone in an unfamiliar town bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "If you're hungry, there's a diner down the street," Ethan offered impulsively, suddenly aware of how ordinary and humble his suggestion was. "It's cheap, but decent. I could take you there, if you want." Surprise flickered through Isabel's gaze, quickly followed by genuine warmth. Her guarded expression softened as a faint smile played on her lips. "You know what? That sounds nice." The tension in Ethan's shoulders eased slightly. "Great, just give me a minute to get cleaned up." She nodded, watching him thoughtfully as he turned away, attempting to scrub oil stains off his hands. In the brief silence, Ethan felt strangely comfortable, far more than he should with someone he'd met less than an hour ago. There was something about her, a quiet vulnerability beneath her obvious elegance, that tugged at him, made him want to know more. When Ethan returned, slightly less stained, and with an old jacket thrown hastily over his worn work shirt, Isabel stepped forward, looking more relaxed now. "Thanks, Ethan," she said softly, sincerity clear in her voice. "I really appreciate this." Their eyes met, holding the connection a moment longer than necessary. It was a simple glance, yet in that brief exchange, something passed between them, an undeniable spark, honest and raw. Ethan cleared his throat awkwardly, suddenly aware of his pulse quickening. "Don't mention it," he replied gently, gesturing toward the door. "Let's go." As they walked side by side into the cool night air, neither spoke immediately, but the silence between them felt comfortable, almost familiar. Ethan cast a sidelong glance at Isabel, wondering who she really was, and why this woman, clearly from a world far removed from his, already felt so undeniably significant. Outside the garage, the evening air had grown crisp, the street lights casting a soft amber glow onto the quiet pavement. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his heart quickening as he glanced at Isabel, wondering how exactly to phrase what he was about to suggest. He'd never been particularly smooth or charming. Words didn't come easy, especially around someone like her. Taking a deep breath, he turned slightly toward her. "Look, I know it's probably not what you're used to," he began, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck as he stumbled through the words. "But Daisy's Diner, just down the street. It's good? Well, decent. Not exactly fancy." He gave her an embarrassed smile. "But if you're hungry, it'll do the trick." Isabel turned to look at him, her gaze softly amused, yet something deeper lingered behind those captivating eyes. Ethan felt heat rise to his face and quickly added, "It's okay if you'd rather not. I get it. It's probably, I'd love to," she said, cutting him off gently. A genuine smile illuminated her features, instantly putting Ethan at ease. Honestly, simple sounds perfect right now. Relief washed through Ethan, mixing with quiet surprise. He hadn't expected her to say yes so easily, especially considering how out of place she seemed in his gritty, ordinary world. "Great," he breathed, barely hiding his excitement. "It's just a short walk." As they made their way down the dimly lit street, Ethan's nerves began to settle, replaced by an unexpected warmth spreading through his chest. Their footsteps echoed softly on the empty sidewalks, comfortable silence settling between them until Isabel broke it with a thoughtful question. "Have you always lived here?" Her voice was gentle, curious, pulling him into conversation effortlessly. "Born and raised," Ethan admitted. "The garage was my dad's. He built it from nothing. After he passed, I kept it going as best I could." He paused, realizing how deeply personal he'd just become. Ethan rarely spoke so openly to anyone, let alone a complete stranger, but there was something about Isabel's presence, calm yet attentive, that drew honesty from him like a magnet. "I'm sorry," Isabel replied softly. There was empathy in her tone, sincere enough to reach deep inside Ethan and touch a hidden part of him that rarely surfaced. They rounded the corner, and Daisy's neon sign flickered warmly in the twilight. Ethan opened the door for Isabel, embarrassed again by the diner's shabby interior, chipped linoleum floors, cracked vinyl booths, and faded vintage posters. But Isabel simply looked around, her expression thoughtful rather than critical. "It's charming," she said quietly, meeting Ethan's nervous gaze. "It feels genuine." Ethan's embarrassment melted away, replaced with gratitude. She understood, without judgment or pity, his world of quiet struggles and small comforts. As he led her to his favorite booth in the corner, Ethan realized that inviting her had been more than just taking a risk. It had opened a door, quietly and unexpectedly, into something that felt entirely new and undeniably real. The diner was quiet, lit by a gentle glow of vintage lights and the flickering neon signs in the windows. Ethan watched cautiously as Isabel settled into the cracked vinyl booth across from him, secretly relieved by how relaxed she appeared despite their humble surroundings. "You weren't kidding," Isabel said softly, her eyes dancing with gentle humor. "It's got charm." "It grows on you," Ethan admitted sheepishly, a smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "Plus, Daisy makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in town." Isabel's gaze met his, sparkling warmly under the dim diner lights. "Well, now you've set the bar high." A comfortable silence lingered briefly, filled with the soft clatter of silverware and the distant hum of country music playing softly from a jukebox in the corner. When their food arrived, simple yet comforting, Ethan relaxed further, grateful that Isabel seemed genuinely content rather than disappointed by their modest meal. As they ate, their conversation grew deeper, shifting seamlessly from casual chatter into something more profound and meaningful. Ethan found himself opening up to Isabel about his life, the relentless struggle of keeping his father's garage alive, the constant fear of losing everything, and the quiet dreams he'd held tightly since childhood. He wasn't used to being so honest, but Isabel's presence seemed to invite vulnerability in a way he'd never experienced before. "I can't imagine the pressure," Isabel said softly, her expression genuinely sympathetic. "To carry your family's legacy alone." "It's hard," Ethan admitted, his voice rough with honesty, "but it's also all I've ever known. I owe it to my dad." "What about your own dreams?" she asked, her voice hesitant yet deeply sincere. "Outside of just survival?" Ethan paused, taken aback. He hadn't thought about personal dreams for years. Survival had consumed everything else. But looking at Isabel, her eyes filled with quiet intensity, Ethan felt an unexpected longing stir inside him. "Someday," he murmured thoughtfully, "I'd love to restore classic cars. Not just for money, but because I love bringing something beautiful back to life, something everyone else gave up on." Isabel smiled gently, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I know that feeling." Ethan studied her carefully. "What about you? What do you dream of?" Isabel hesitated, her eyes suddenly guarded, a shadow briefly crossing her features before fading again into quiet honesty. "Freedom, I suppose. Freedom to choose my own path, to live without expectations or pressures from others. It's hard to explain, but I envy the simplicity you have here, even if it's challenging." Ethan leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Isabel's words hinted at a hidden weight, a life he couldn't fully imagine. "It seems like you already have everything," he said softly. "But I guess it's not always that simple, is it?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes holding his in quiet understanding. "No, it's not. Sometimes what we really want has nothing to do with money or success. Sometimes it's just about finding a place or a person that makes us feel real again." The sincerity in her voice touched something deep within Ethan, something vulnerable and raw. He realized then, as their conversation continued late into the night, that this woman, who'd walked into his life so unexpectedly, was far more complex and intriguing than he could have ever imagined, and the connection forming between them felt utterly real, profound, and impossible to ignore. The door clicked softly behind Isabel as she stepped into the small motel room, the quiet hum of the distant highway drifting gently through the thin, faded curtains. She sat carefully on the edge of the worn-out mattress, the springs creaking softly beneath her weight, a stark reminder of how drastically different this night was from every other in her life. Isabel pulled out her phone, hesitation filling her movements. She stared for a moment at the sleek, polished screen, feeling the crushing weight of her own reality return. Ethan's warmth still lingered in her memory, the way he had smiled so sincerely, his unguarded laughter at the diner, and the genuine kindness that had shone clearly from his tired eyes. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering her thoughts before tapping her phone awake. Immediately, messages flooded the screen, unanswered emails, missed calls, voicemails filled with carefully worded urgency. She scrolled past them quickly, stopping as her gaze fell on a news notification with her own name, boldly printed across the headline, "Isabel Montgomery still missing. Whereabouts of heiress unknown." She exhaled slowly, staring at her own photograph beneath the sensational words, a picture from one of her family's elaborate charity galas, glittering diamonds around her neck, her elegant evening gown flawless, the image of effortless perfection. But the smile on her face in the photograph felt hollow, an emptiness hidden behind careful poise, a false joy she'd grown painfully accustomed to. Here, in this tiny room, miles from marble halls and high society expectations, Isabel felt strangely alive. Ethan didn't know who she was, didn't see a fortune, didn't expect polished smiles or perfectly rehearsed answers. For the first time, she felt genuinely seen, not as Isabel Montgomery, billionaire heiress and future CEO of Montgomery Enterprises, but simply as herself. A woman, a person with dreams and fears and desires just like anyone else. She rose from the bed, crossing the room to gaze out through the window, the sleepy town peaceful under the faint glow of moonlight. Her pulse quickened at the thought of Ethan. The intensity of his gaze, the sincerity in his voice as he shared his hopes and hardships with a stranger who felt far less distant now. Isabel knew her secret couldn't stay hidden forever. The truth would inevitably catch up, risking the fragile connection they had begun building. With another sigh, she laid her phone down, the screen dimming to black. For just a little while longer, she wanted to hold on to this feeling of authenticity, of freedom from expectations and pretense. But deep down, Isabel knew the truth. She couldn't run from her life forever. Eventually, Ethan would learn who she truly was, and she feared more than anything that the revelation might shatter the fragile, honest bond they had begun forming tonight. As she stared into the gentle darkness, Isabel Montgomery made a silent promise to herself. Somehow she would find a way to hold on to this moment of realness, even if it meant risking everything she had ever known. The morning sun peeked through the dusty blinds, casting thin golden stripes across Ethan's cluttered workspace. He stood staring absently at the engine parts scattered across the workbench, his hands pausing mid-task, the wrench forgotten in his grip. His mind, normally focused and pragmatic, wandered relentlessly back to Isabel, the warmth in her voice, the guarded vulnerability behind her carefully composed eyes. It was as if their conversations at Daisy's diner had etched themselves deep into his consciousness, refusing to fade. Ethan sighed softly, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He wasn't the type to dwell on encounters with customers, especially not someone as out of reach as Isabel clearly was. Yet, despite himself, he couldn't shake the vivid memory of her laughter, soft, genuine, and slightly surprised, as they talked easily over plates of simple food. The sincerity of her gaze haunted him. She'd seemed so authentic, yet clearly burdened by something she couldn't quite reveal. Across town, in the modest motel room, Isabel sat curled on the worn-out armchair, her coffee growing cold as she stared vacantly toward the window. Her designer handbag lay forgotten on the small table beside her, its elegance at odds with her humble surroundings. Thoughts of Ethan consumed her entirely, overpowering the endless list of duties and demands waiting in her real life. His sincerity, his quiet dignity, despite life's heavy burdens, struck her deeply in a way she hadn't anticipated. Isabel had met countless men who wore masks of charm and wealth, who used eloquent words to hide shallow intentions, but Ethan was different. His honesty was raw, genuine, stripped of pretense. He was a man shaped by struggle, yet unspoiled by it, a rare authenticity she'd seldom seen. The idea of leaving this quiet town and returning to a life filled with cold expectations, manipulative alliances, and hollow smiles suddenly felt almost unbearable. She knew the truth would eventually come out. Her hidden identity loomed over her like an impending storm. The thought of Ethan discovering who she really was filled her with dread, fearing he'd see her as just another rich, privileged heiress, not the person she truly was beneath it all. Back at the garage, Ethan finally snapped out of his daze as the phone rang sharply, cutting through his distracted thoughts. He reached for it automatically, answering with practiced efficiency, yet his mind lingered stubbornly on Isabel, wondering if she'd ever step back into his humble, grease-stained world, or if their brief, memorable connection was merely a fleeting moment he was destined to replay in his thoughts, over and over again. Ethan spent most of the morning lost in his routine, burying himself in engine parts and overdue repairs. He moved mechanically through each task, but his mind continued to drift, replaying memories of Isabel, the graceful way she'd laughed softly at daisies, how easily she'd listened as he spoke about struggles he rarely shared. Ethan shook his head firmly, trying to dispel the distracting thoughts. He knew he shouldn't get attached to someone who clearly belonged to another world, yet he couldn't seem to help himself. Suddenly, the familiar low rumble of a luxury engine broke through his focus, pulling his attention sharply toward the garage entrance. Ethan's pulse quickened slightly, anticipation stirring in his chest as the glossy black Mercedes pulled smoothly into the driveway. Isabel stepped out, her elegant features illuminated by sunlight streaming gently through the dusty window panes. Ethan felt his heart skip slightly at the unexpected sight of her, immediately noticing the way her eyes softened when they met his. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Isabel said lightly, offering him a hesitant smile that almost hid her obvious nervousness. The car felt strange again. Ethan quickly wiped his hands, stepping toward her with a reassuring nod. "You're always welcome here. Let me take a look." He lifted the hood, carefully inspecting the pristine engine he'd already become familiar with. His experienced eyes moved over each component, soon realizing nothing appeared amiss. He glanced at Isabel thoughtfully, wondering if there was a deeper reason behind her sudden return. "I don't see any obvious issues," Ethan admitted gently. "Are you sure it felt off?" Isabel hesitated, a soft blush coloring her cheeks, her elegant composure momentarily wavering. "To be honest," she finally confessed, her voice lower and softer, "maybe I just imagined it." Ethan studied her expression closely, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's okay," he said softly, warmth creeping into his voice. "I'm glad you're here." Isabel exhaled slowly, visibly relaxing under his gentle reassurance. "Me too." They stood quietly for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them in the comfortable silence. Finally, Ethan motioned toward the small seating area inside the garage. "Would you like to stay for a while?" She nodded eagerly, her eyes brightening with genuine warmth. "I'd like that." As Ethan brewed fresh coffee in the small, cluttered corner of his workshop, they fell into easy conversation again, speaking openly as though they'd known each other for years rather than mere days. Isabel listened intently, leaning slightly forward in her seat, fascinated by Ethan's stories of fixing cars with his father, of childhood memories spent tinkering in this very garage. In turn, she shared small glimpses of her own life, carefully avoiding specifics but revealing just enough to hint at the pressure and loneliness she'd long endured. Minutes stretched comfortably into hours, neither willing to let go of the unexpected magic unfolding between them. Isabel felt herself drawn deeper into Ethan's quiet, earnest world, captivated by his strength, sincerity, and humility. For Ethan, Isabel's gentle, genuine presence filled a void he hadn't realized existed, and he found himself longing for more moments like these. Both knew their worlds were dangerously far apart, yet as they spoke, laughed, and connected effortlessly beneath the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the old garage windows, the distance between them felt strangely irrelevant, bridged for now by a bond that neither could fully explain nor wanted to break. As the sun began its gentle descent, bathing the streets in soft golden hues, Ethan glanced toward Isabel and made an impulsive decision. Setting down his coffee mug, he offered her an earnest smile. "Have you really seen our little town yet?" Isabel looked surprised but intrigued, curiosity brightening her eyes. "Only the diner and your garage," she admitted, her voice warm with humor. "Are you volunteering to be my guide?" He laughed softly, pushing aside any doubts. "Something like that. Come on, I'll show you around." They stepped outside into the late afternoon glow, the sleepy streets lined with modest homes, charming storefronts, and tall, sprawling oaks that whispered quietly in the breeze. Ethan watched carefully as Isabel took it all in, observing how her guarded expression gradually melted into one of gentle wonder. As they walked side by side, Ethan pointed out landmarks that meant something to him, like the small brick schoolhouse where he'd spent his childhood years, or Mrs. Thompson's flower shop, its windows always decorated with vibrant blooms that seemed to defy the quiet town's struggles. Isabel listened intently, captivated by his stories, her laughter mingling softly with his as he shared anecdotes that painted the town in vivid color. They stopped by the local bakery, where Ethan introduced Isabel to Martha, the elderly owner who greeted Ethan warmly and immediately offered Isabel a fresh-baked cookie. Isabel's face lit up, touched by the unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. "It's always like this here," Ethan explained gently, noticing her reaction. "People look after each other. We might not have much, but we take care of our own." Isabel glanced at Ethan, her eyes softening with genuine admiration. "There's something truly special about that," she said quietly. "You're lucky." Ethan smiled, nodding thoughtfully. "I suppose sometimes I forget that." As evening approached, they reached the small wooden bridge overlooking the town's quiet river. They paused together, leaning against the weathered railing as sunlight danced gently across the water's surface. Ethan stole a glance at Isabel, catching the peaceful, contented look that settled softly over her features. "This is my favorite place," Ethan confessed quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Whenever things get overwhelming, I come here. Reminds me there's still peace, even when everything else is chaos." Isabel's gaze remained on the shimmering water, but Ethan saw emotion flicker in her eyes, raw and genuine. "I envy you, Ethan. I've spent my whole life surrounded by wealth, power, expectations, but I've never had a place like this." He turned toward her slightly, his voice gentle. "Maybe it's not too late to find one." Their eyes met, and something deep and profound passed between them. Isabel's breath caught softly, her heart quickening, aware now of how easily Ethan had opened up a part of herself she hadn't known existed. "Thank you," she whispered softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "For what?" "For showing me your world. It's beautiful, Ethan." He smiled warmly, feeling a spark of quiet pride, grateful he'd taken the risk. Together, beneath a painted sky of purples and oranges, they stood silently, both keenly aware they'd stepped beyond casual conversation and stumbled into something deeper, something undeniably real, as enchanting as the small-town magic that had brought them together. The city lights glittered coldly outside Isabel's apartment window, a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of the small town she'd just left behind. She stood quietly, gazing out from the lavish penthouse, the silence around her heavy and oppressive, despite the luxury she was surrounded by. Polished marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, designer furniture carefully arranged by interior decorators, it all felt strangely hollow and unfamiliar tonight, as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass, elegant yet distant. Isabel barely recognized the carefully poised, sophisticated woman looking back at her, dressed in clothes chosen to project power and wealth. Her memories of Ethan, his earnest smile, the comfortable warmth of his voice, the honesty in his eyes, only amplified her loneliness. Ethan's world had been messy, imperfect, real. Hers felt sterile by comparison, neatly arranged yet emotionally barren. With a sigh, she turned away, walking across the expansive living room, her footsteps echoing softly. Her gaze landed on a family portrait set prominently on the mantelpiece, her parents smiling with practiced poise, their eyes distant, beneath the carefully posed smiles. Isabel's childhood had been filled with privilege, yet the cold formality of wealth left her starved for genuine affection. She'd learned early to hide behind a polished mask, burying her true self beneath layers of refinement and control. Returning to this life after experiencing Ethan's simple yet authentic world was like plunging into ice-cold water, shocking her senses and leaving her numb. She picked up her phone, scrolling through dozens of missed calls and texts from her assistant, her mother, and business associates, each message dragging her further back into her role as Isabel Montgomery, the poised heiress expected to inherit an empire. Yet amidst all the noise, all she truly wanted was Ethan's calm voice, his easy laughter, and the unspoken comfort he'd offered without hesitation. Isabel had never felt such intense longing, such deep, soul-deep emptiness, as she felt in this lavish apartment, now painfully aware of what she'd unknowingly been missing her entire life. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, unwilling to break completely, even in solitude. She knew the bitter reality. Her life here, in this glittering city, was worlds apart from Ethan's. Crossing that divide might be impossible, yet the idea of never seeing him again felt equally unbearable. Isabel closed her eyes, breathing deeply, silently promising herself she wouldn't surrender to the emptiness of this life. Somehow, some way, she had to hold on to the feeling Ethan had awakened in her, the powerful, authentic connection that had finally made her feel alive. Rain tapped persistently against the garage roof, a steady rhythm that echoed Ethan's growing anxiety. He paced restlessly, waiting for the call he'd been dreading, the gnawing feeling in his stomach intensifying with every passing minute. Bills and unpaid invoices lay scattered across his cluttered desk, stark reminders of the crushing weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He'd spent sleepless nights doing mental math, but each calculation ended the same: he simply didn't have enough. When the phone finally rang, it cut through the tense silence like a blade. Ethan snatched it up immediately, heart pounding against his ribs. "Hayes Auto Repair," he answered, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Hayes," came the cold, impersonal voice on the other end. Ethan recognized the banker's clipped tone instantly, his stomach tightening painfully. "We've reviewed your situation, and unfortunately we can't grant another extension. Without payment by the end of the month, we'll have no choice but to repossess the property." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened, knuckles turning white as dread clawed up his throat. "I just need a bit more time, please," he begged quietly, swallowing hard against the lump forming in his throat. "Business has been slow, but I'll find a way. This place means everything to me." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," the banker responded firmly, devoid of sympathy. "The bank has been more than lenient already. The decision is final." The line clicked abruptly, leaving Ethan standing in stunned silence, the receiver still pressed numbly against his ear. The sound of rain intensified, a relentless reminder of how completely alone and helpless he felt in this moment. His vision blurred briefly, hot frustration building behind his eyes. Slowly lowering the phone, Ethan slumped onto the worn stool beside the workbench, burying his face into his grease-stained hands. He thought about his father, about the hours they'd spent working side by side, the dreams they'd shared of building something meaningful together. The garage wasn't just bricks and steel. It was the last remaining connection Ethan had to his father's memory, to the legacy he'd vowed to protect. A sharp, bitter sense of defeat rose in Ethan's chest, suffocating him. His thoughts drifted to Isabel, remembering the quiet admiration in her eyes when he'd shown her around town, her genuine smile when they'd stood together on the old bridge. He wished, more than anything, he could talk to her now, to hear the soothing reassurance of her voice. But their worlds were too distant. His struggles belonged to him alone. Drawing a deep, ragged breath, Ethan forced himself to stand, staring blankly at the chaotic workshop around him. He wouldn't give up easily, he promised himself fiercely, desperation sharpening his resolve. Somehow, he would find a way to save the garage, to save the life he'd worked so hard to build, no matter how impossible it seemed. Isabel sat at the far end of the polished conference table, half listening as company executives droned on about quarterly profits and investment forecasts. She absently twisted the delicate gold bracelet around her wrist, her mind miles away, locked firmly in a small, run-down garage where Ethan's sincerity and warmth had awakened something deep inside her. Suddenly, she heard Ethan's name spoken by someone at the opposite end of the table, pulling her abruptly from her daydream. "A small garage owner in the area is about to lose his property to the bank," one of her executives reported dryly, thumbing casually through a financial report. "It's prime real estate, good for redevelopment, owned by a man named Ethan Hayes." Isabel's heart froze, her breath caught sharply in her throat. The room around her blurred momentarily as she struggled to maintain composure, every nerve in her body suddenly alert, Ethan was in trouble, serious trouble. She felt a rush of panic at the thought of him losing everything, of his gentle, resilient spirit crushed beneath the merciless wheels of financial ruin. The executives continued talking, oblivious to Isabel's turmoil, casually discussing plans to capitalize on the property's potential. Isabel's pulse quickened with anger, a deep protective instinct flaring in her chest. Yet fear quickly tempered her outrage. If she intervened now, if she used her influence or money to help, Ethan would inevitably discover her true identity. She imagined the betrayal and hurt in his eyes when he learned she'd hidden her wealth and status from him, afraid he would no longer see her as the person who'd laughed with him in a humble diner, walked beside him through a sleepy town, and shared genuine dreams beneath a starlit sky. Isabel's mind raced desperately, searching for solutions. Every option carried risk, threatening the fragile bond she'd carefully built with Ethan. She wanted nothing more than to protect him, to shield him from the harshness of the world he struggled against. Yet she knew his pride, his integrity. Ethan would never willingly accept charity, especially not from someone who'd hidden so much from him. The meeting ended abruptly, and Isabel quickly rose, slipping silently from the room, her legs weak beneath her. Alone in the privacy of her office, she sank into her chair, gripping the edge of her desk tightly, desperately weighing her choices. She couldn't ignore Ethan's suffering. His strength and honesty had touched her too deeply, but neither could she bear losing his trust. Tears burned behind her eyes, frustration and fear knotting painfully in her chest. Taking a shaky breath, Isabel steadied herself, knowing she had to act carefully, quietly. If there was a way to help Ethan without destroying their connection, without losing him, she would find it, no matter how difficult or delicate the path might be. Deep down, she knew she was stepping toward dangerous ground, risking everything she valued most. But the image of Ethan's gentle eyes, his genuine laughter and quiet strength, filled her with a determination stronger than her fear. Somehow, she would protect him, even if it meant risking the secret she had fought so hard to keep hidden. The afternoon was gray and overcast, casting a gloomy haze over Ethan's garage. Ethan was hunched beneath the hood of a battered old pickup truck, his hands moving slowly, weighed down by worry and exhaustion. When he heard the now familiar growl of Isabel's Mercedes pulling into the driveway, his heart skipped involuntarily. Despite the heavy burdens that threatened to consume him, just the thought of seeing her again lifted his spirit slightly, even though he knew he shouldn't let himself feel that way. Isabel stepped out of the sleek car, offering Ethan a gentle, hesitant smile that quickly faded into concern as she noticed the shadows beneath his eyes, the weary set of his shoulders. She had returned under the excuse of car trouble, a careful lie she'd rehearsed in her head, but the truth was far simpler. She needed to know he was all right, needed to see for herself. "Car problems again?" Ethan asked, trying to sound cheerful, but unable to completely mask the tiredness in his voice. "Something feels off," Isabel lied softly, stepping closer, her gaze carefully studying Ethan's face. "But I think I mostly just wanted someone trustworthy to look at it." Ethan wiped his hands absently on a rag, forcing a small smile, grateful for her presence despite the heavy weight he carried. "Let's take a look." As Ethan leaned over the engine, Isabel stood quietly beside him, her presence comforting even in silence. After a moment she spoke, her voice gentle and tentative. "Is everything okay, Ethan? You seem exhausted." Ethan paused, hesitating. Part of him wanted to shield her from his troubles, maintain the illusion of strength. Yet the sincerity in her eyes broke through his guarded exterior, loosening his resolve. "I'm struggling," he admitted quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I might lose this place. The bank called. I'm almost out of time." Pain flickered briefly in Isabel's eyes, but she carefully masked it, knowing Ethan wouldn't want pity. Instead, she reached out softly, touching his arm, the warmth of her touch comforting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," she whispered. her voice full of genuine empathy. "But you're strong, Ethan, stronger than you realize. You've fought so hard, kept going despite everything. That courage counts for something." Her words seeped gently into his heart, offering warmth and reassurance he hadn't known he desperately needed. Ethan turned to look directly into her eyes, the connection between them strong, magnetic. The financial burden hadn't lifted, but for a brief moment the weight pressing against his chest seemed lighter, more manageable. "Thank you," he murmured softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I needed to hear that." They stood quietly together, the silence comfortable rather than awkward, sharing an understanding deeper than mere words. Isabel felt torn, aching to solve his problems with a single call, yet knowing it would shatter their fragile bond. She wanted to protect him, yet also knew the greatest gift she could offer in this moment was simply her presence, her belief in him. As daylight dimmed around the garage, Ethan felt a quiet strength returning to him, nurtured by Isabel's genuine support and trust. His path was still uncertain, yet he found himself feeling braver, stronger, simply because she was by his side, believing in him, seeing something valuable inside him that he himself had nearly forgotten existed. As evening shadows lengthened, the garage grew quiet, wrapped in the softness of twilight. Ethan lowered the hood of Isabel's car gently, letting out a deep, weary sigh as the last traces of daylight faded through the grimy windows. The tension in his shoulders, the heaviness in his chest, seemed too much to bear alone any longer. Turning to Isabel, Ethan saw her watching him with quiet intensity, concern radiating from her gentle eyes. He hesitated briefly, pride warring with the need to unburden his heart, before finally surrendering to the trust he felt with her. "I don't know what to do, Isabel," Ethan confessed quietly, his voice raw with honesty. He swallowed painfully, staring at his grease-stained hands. "This garage was my dad's dream, his legacy. I promised him I'd keep it alive, but now I feel like I've failed him. The bank's closing in, and I can't fix this one." Isabel moved closer, her heart aching deeply for Ethan, longing to reach out and ease his pain. She gently touched his hand, guiding him carefully to sit beside her on a battered old bench in the corner of the shop. Her presence was warm, steady, offering comfort without judgment or pity. "Ethan, listen to me," Isabel whispered firmly, searching his eyes with quiet determination. "You haven't failed anyone. You've carried this place on your shoulders alone, fought harder than anyone I know. That kind of courage matters more than you realize." Ethan's shoulders shook slightly, the rawness of his emotions slipping past the wall he'd fought so hard to maintain. "It feels like nothing I do matters. Every step forward pushes me 2 steps back. And now I could lose everything." Isabel gently squeezed his hand, her voice trembling slightly with her own vulnerability. "I know you think this garage defines you, but you're more than just this building. Your strength, your kindness. They're part of you, Ethan. No one can take that away, no matter what happens." He lifted his gaze slowly, searching her face, his eyes holding hers with profound sincerity. "Why do I feel like you understand me better than anyone ever has?" Her heartbeat quickened as Isabel met his intense gaze, her voice softening even further. "Because I see you, Ethan. Not the struggles or the burdens, but the person underneath. The one who made me feel welcome and real in a way no one else ever has." Ethan's breath caught softly, his heart tightening as he recognized his own feelings reflected in her words. The boundaries between their vastly different worlds melted away, leaving only an authentic connection that felt stronger and more real than anything either of them had ever known. Without thinking, Ethan gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Isabel's face, his fingers lingering tenderly against her cheek. Her eyes widened briefly, surprised but unafraid, welcoming his touch. They sat quietly, the silence deep and meaningful, neither daring to speak and shatter the fragile moment of intimacy and trust they'd created together. Ethan knew the road ahead remained uncertain, his struggles far from over. Yet, as he sat with Isabel in the soft shadows of his garage, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet resilience, a determination born from the simple, powerful realization that he was no longer alone. For the first time, he truly believed that somehow they would both find a way forward, together. The quiet charm of the town square hummed softly with activity, locals strolling leisurely along the sidewalks and shops closing up for the evening. Isabel walked slowly, taking comfort in the familiar simplicity she'd grown to love. The modest storefronts, the genuine smiles exchanged freely between neighbors. For a brief, blissful moment, the weight of her complicated life felt distant, nearly forgotten. But that fragile peace shattered instantly as Isabel caught sight of a figure across the street, a woman holding a camera, her sharp eyes locked intently on Isabel's face. Recognition flared painfully through Isabel's chest. She knew exactly who this woman was. Kate Marshall, a relentless reporter from the city, notorious for uncovering secrets and exposing hidden truths. Isabel's pulse quickened, panic rising like a wave. Kate's eyes lit with excitement, her expression triumphant as she quickly snapped several pictures. Isabel's heart dropped, dread pooling bitterly in her stomach as the reporter hurried toward her, determined and predatory. "Isabel Montgomery," Kate said confidently, her tone accusatory rather than questioning. "I knew it was you. Care to explain what the heiress of Montgomery Enterprises is doing in a small town, far from your usual glamorous circles?" Isabel swallowed hard, her carefully maintained composure fracturing beneath the harsh reality crashing down on her. Her voice shook slightly as she tried desperately to maintain a fragile mask of calm. "I'm sorry, you must be mistaken. My name is—" "Don't bother," Kate interrupted sharply, raising her camera again. "We both know who you are, disappearing from the public eye, avoiding your family's events, now hiding out in this little town. This could be my biggest story yet." Isabel's breath quickened painfully, fear tightening her chest. She thought of Ethan, his gentle trust, the connection they'd built entirely without pretenses. She knew the devastating effect the truth would have, the betrayal he'd feel learning she had hidden so much. "Please," Isabel whispered desperately, her eyes pleading, "can't you just leave this alone?" Kate's expression hardened, unyielding. "Not a chance. This is news, Isabel. People deserve to know why a Montgomery heiress is hiding out in the middle of nowhere. What, or who, is keeping you here?" Isabel felt trapped, helpless. Her heart twisted sharply as Ethan's gentle eyes appeared clearly in her mind, warm with trust and sincerity. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, but it seemed inevitable now. Secrets always surfaced, no matter how carefully hidden. Before Kate could ask another pointed question, Isabel quickly turned away, her breath ragged as she moved hurriedly down the sidewalk, desperate to put distance between herself and the intrusive glare of the reporter's camera lens. Every step felt heavy with dread, the illusion of safety shattered completely. In her heart, Isabel knew the quiet life she'd briefly shared with Ethan was slipping rapidly through her fingers. Soon he would learn the truth, the painful, unavoidable reality of who she truly was, and she feared deeply that the fragile bond they'd carefully nurtured might not survive the brutal impact of her secrets finally coming to light. Ethan stood at the front counter of the garage, sipping lukewarm coffee as the early morning sun slowly pushed away the last remnants of darkness. He felt cautiously optimistic for once, buoyed by Isabel's heartfelt encouragement and the quiet intimacy they'd shared. Yet that fleeting peace vanished instantly as the small television mounted on the garage wall crackled to life with a news broadcast. He glanced up absently, about to switch it off, when his eyes landed sharply on the screen. Isabel's face was prominently displayed, beautiful, poised, and unmistakably hers, but completely out of place beneath a headline that screamed, "Missing Heiress Discovered, Hiding Out in Rural Town." Ethan's heart slammed painfully against his chest, his breath tightening with each word that spilled from the reporter's mouth. Isabel Montgomery, billionaire heiress and sole successor to Montgomery Enterprises, has been spotted in a remote town far from her lavish lifestyle. Sources confirm she's been staying secretly, under a false identity. What could be the reason behind this shocking disappearance? Stunned, Ethan stared blankly at the screen, disbelief and humiliation warring fiercely inside him. A crushing weight pressed down on him, suffocatingly heavy, as realization dawned sharply. Isabel, the woman he'd opened up to, trusted completely, wasn't who she'd claimed. Everything they'd shared, the deep conversations, the comforting silences, now felt like a carefully crafted illusion, designed to conceal who she truly was. Beneath the shock, a raw anger burned slowly, building until it felt unbearable. Ethan's fists clenched painfully, knuckles whitening as hurt and betrayal welled fiercely in his chest. He'd been vulnerable with her, shared his deepest fears and struggles. Now he felt foolish, played, like just another pawn in a privileged woman's temporary escape from reality. A sudden noise outside snapped Ethan from his bitter thoughts, and he turned quickly toward the garage door. Isabel stood there, her expression fragile, guilty, eyes wide with fear as she met his gaze. Clearly, she'd seen the news too. "Ethan, please," she whispered desperately, stepping hesitantly toward him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never wanted you to find out this way." He held up his hand sharply, stopping her approach, his voice rough with hurt and accusation. "Then how exactly did you want me to find out? Or was this always just a game to you, some rich girl's adventure pretending to be ordinary?" "No, Ethan," Isabel pleaded softly, her voice shaking, eyes filled with pain. "None of it was a lie. Everything between us was real. I promise." Ethan shook his head bitterly, unable to meet her gaze. "Real?" he repeated harshly, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "How can I trust that anything you've said was real, Isabel? Or should I say, Miss Montgomery? Clearly, you didn't trust me enough to be honest." Isabel reached for him again, desperation flooding her face, but Ethan stepped back instinctively, heart aching sharply. "I need you to leave," he said quietly, his tone firm despite the turmoil ripping him apart inside. "I can't deal with this right now." Isabel's shoulders slumped painfully, tears escaping silently down her cheeks as she turned reluctantly away, walking slowly from the garage. Ethan stood alone in the sudden emptiness, bitterness and regret tightening around him until he could hardly breathe. Everything he'd begun to hope for was now tainted by deception, and Ethan wondered bitterly if the pain of trusting someone again was even worth it. Rain poured relentlessly, battering the windows of Ethan's garage with merciless insistence. Isabel stood hesitantly near the open entrance, drenched and trembling slightly, her normally poised demeanor shattered completely, her chest tightened with an aching desperation as she watched Ethan's rigid back, sensing the emotional distance he'd firmly placed between them. "Ethan, please," Isabel began softly, stepping slowly toward him, her voice raw with vulnerability. "Let me explain. I never meant to hurt you." Ethan turned sharply, pain etched deeply across his face, his eyes hollow and guarded. He raised his hand to stop her approach, shaking his head bitterly. "Explain what, Isabel?" His voice dripped with hurt, roughened by anger and humiliation. "That everything you said, everything we shared, was built on lies? Or that you just wanted a break from your wealthy life, and I was convenient?" "No," Isabel cried, her eyes glistening with tears, desperate to bridge the terrible chasm that had opened between them. "It wasn't like that, I swear. Being here with you, it was the first real thing I've felt in years." Ethan's jaw tightened painfully, his gaze flickering briefly with raw, wounded emotion before his eyes turned hard again. "Then why hide who you really were?" he demanded fiercely, voice shaking with the weight of betrayal. "Did you think so little of me, Isabel, that I wouldn't understand or that I'd use you?" "Of course not," Isabel whispered fiercely, anguish radiating from her as she pleaded for him to understand. "I hid my identity because I wanted you to see me, truly see me, for who I am, not what my name represents. For the first time, I wasn't Isabel Montgomery, the heiress. I was just Isabel, a real person with real feelings. I was scared, Ethan, scared I'd lose the connection we built if you knew the truth. Ethan closed his eyes, turning away as though the sight of her caused him physical pain. He struggled to steady his breathing, the crushing hurt making every word feel bitter and sharp. "The truth matters, Isabel," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper, strained by the intense ache in his chest. "If you'd trusted me enough, you would have known I'd never judge you for who you really are. But you didn't. You never gave me a chance." He faced her again, eyes shining with barely restrained pain. "I opened up to you. I shared things I've never told anyone, and now I feel like an idiot. Do you know how humiliating this is?" Isabel moved forward instinctively, her heart breaking at the sight of his anguish. "I'm so sorry," she whispered brokenly, her voice pleading and filled with regret. "Please, Ethan." "No, he interrupted sharply, voice shaking with emotion as he stepped back, widening the space between them. "Just go, Isabel. Whatever this was, it's done." Pain flashed sharply in her eyes, tears slipping freely down her face. For a long, agonizing moment, Isabel stood frozen, heartbreak written clearly across her trembling features. Finally, she turned slowly, retreating silently into the relentless downpour. Ethan stood rooted in place, fists clenched tightly as he stared at the empty space she'd left behind. He felt hollow, broken, and deeply wounded. Part of him desperately wanted to chase after her, to take back the harshness of his words, but his hurt was too raw, too overwhelming. All he could do was stand alone in the dim, rain-drenched garage, heart aching, as the painful echo of their confrontation lingered cruelly in the air. Back in her lavish penthouse, Isabel moved slowly through rooms that had never felt emptier. Moonlight spilled softly across polished marble floors, illuminating the expensive furnishings that now seemed meaningless, hollow reminders of a life she no longer felt connected to. She sank onto the edge of her bed, clutching the soft silk sheets as her heart twisted painfully inside her chest, heavy with bitter regret. Ethan's wounded expression replayed endlessly in her mind, his raw hurt etched deeply into her memory. Every harsh word he'd spoken, every accusation he'd hurled, though painfully justified, echoed cruelly, leaving Isabel feeling exposed and helpless. The image of Ethan standing alone in his garage, betrayed and heartbroken, tore relentlessly at her conscience. She'd known from the beginning that keeping her identity hidden was risky, yet she never imagined just how sharply the revelation would cut him. Isabel had underestimated the depth of her own feelings, how fiercely she would come to care for Ethan, how desperately she would yearn for the quiet authenticity of their connection, now seemingly shattered beyond repair. Isabel rose abruptly, pacing restlessly toward the large windows overlooking the sprawling city lights below. Her reflection stared back, elegant, poised, and utterly miserable. She'd spent her life conforming to expectations, bound tightly by wealth, status, and duty. Until Ethan, she'd believed it impossible to break free from the gilded cage of privilege that suffocated her daily. Now she realized that without him, even freedom felt empty. Tears blurred her vision, slipping quietly down her cheeks as she imagined never seeing Ethan again, never experiencing the warmth of his voice, the sincerity of his gaze, the strength of his embrace. She longed to run back to him, to beg forgiveness, to promise complete honesty from this moment forward. Yet fear gripped her heart tightly, whispering cruelly that Ethan might never look at her the same way again, even if she did return. She reached for her phone instinctively, her fingers trembling as she hovered over his number. Her pulse quickened with longing and anxiety, torn between wanting to call and fearing his rejection. Could she blame him if he turned away? The pain she'd caused him felt unforgivable, yet the ache in her chest was unbearable, overwhelming every logical thought. Lowering her phone reluctantly, Isabel sank heavily onto the plush sofa, feeling completely alone and profoundly lost. Wealth, privilege, and power, all meaningless compared to the simple truth she now fully recognized. She loved Ethan deeply, fiercely, far beyond the superficial comforts her luxurious life offered. Isabel knew she had to find a way back to him, to bridge the painful gap her secret had opened. The path ahead would be difficult, uncertain, perhaps impossible, but losing Ethan felt infinitely worse. In the quiet solitude of her empty penthouse, she vowed silently, passionately, to do whatever it took to heal the damage she'd caused, to reclaim the one thing she now realized mattered more to her than anything else: love, real and true, with the only man who'd ever truly seen her for who she was. Ethan sat alone in the silent garage, the faint glow of a single overhead lamp casting long shadows over the empty workspace. Outside, darkness had settled over the town, blanketing the streets in a quiet stillness. But Ethan's thoughts raced relentlessly, offering no peace. He leaned heavily against the workbench, eyes unfocused, replaying the painful confrontation with Isabel again and again. Her voice, broken, pleading, deeply sincere, echoed through his mind, haunting him with the truth he'd been too hurt to accept in the heat of the moment. The memory of her tears, the anguish in her eyes, gnawed deeply at his conscience, slowly dismantling the wall of anger he'd hastily built around his wounded pride. He recalled every conversation, every tender moment they'd shared. The warmth and sincerity of Isabel's laughter, the quiet comfort of her presence, the raw vulnerability she'd shown him. They couldn't all be lies. Could they? Ethan's chest tightened painfully as doubt crept in, nudging away the stubborn resentment he'd clung to fiercely. Maybe Isabel had hidden the truth out of fear, out of desperation, not malice or arrogance. A heavy sigh escaped Ethan's lips as he sank onto a nearby stool, running a tired hand over his face. He knew what betrayal felt like, knew intimately how it could twist a heart into knots of bitterness. But somehow, deep inside, he sensed that Isabel's actions weren't driven by selfishness. Her pain had been real, tangible, as palpable as his own. What if she'd truly feared losing him? What if she genuinely believed that hiding her identity was the only way they could have something honest and real? His mind drifted back to the way she'd looked at him on the bridge, beneath a sky painted with fading sunlight. That Isabel, soft, genuine, and unguarded, felt too authentic to dismiss. The realization twisted Ethan's gut sharply with remorse. Had he pushed away someone who genuinely cared for him, simply because he'd been too hurt, too proud, to listen? He stood abruptly, pacing restlessly, the quiet stillness of the garage amplifying his thoughts. The image of Isabel standing soaked and trembling in the rain, pleading for understanding, stabbed him like a blade of guilt. Ethan knew trust wasn't easy, and it hurt to feel deceived, but the truth was becoming painfully clear. He'd allowed anger and wounded pride to blind him from seeing Isabel's true intentions. He paused by the window, staring out into the darkness, his resolve strengthening slowly but steadily. Isabel had taken a risk too, revealing the parts of herself she'd always hidden. Ethan couldn't deny the truth any longer. Despite her secrecy, Isabel had been genuine in ways that mattered deeply. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Ethan felt a quiet determination build within him. He didn't know exactly how to mend the hurt he'd caused, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to try. Isabel had stepped toward him once, courageously honest, vulnerable. Now, it was his turn to find the courage to reach back and rebuild what they'd nearly lost. Ethan awoke early, the pale dawn light filtering weakly through the dusty windows of his modest apartment above the garage. He rose with a heavy heart, his shoulders tense beneath the crushing weight of responsibility that greeted him every morning. His reflection in the mirror looked tired and worn, eyes shadowed with restless nights spent searching desperately for answers that never came. He opened the garage doors reluctantly, greeted by the familiar scent of oil and metal. Normally, the smell comforted him, a reminder of simpler times spent working side by side with his father, but now it felt bitter, like a reminder of everything he stood to lose. He glanced at the pile of overdue bills scattered across his workbench, anxiety twisting sharply in his gut. Throughout the day, townspeople stopped by with concerned faces and hesitant offers of help. Mrs. Thompson from the flower shop arrived first, gently suggesting she could gather a community fundraiser. Ethan, though deeply touched, quietly declined, the bitter sting of wounded pride tightening his throat. He refused to become the town's charity case, no matter how well-intentioned their offers were. By midday, John Turner from the hardware store appeared at the garage door, awkwardly shuffling his feet as he offered Ethan a small loan from his own savings. Ethan thanked him quietly, voice rough with gratitude and shame, yet politely refused again. The last thing he wanted was to burden people who had their own struggles, their own families and businesses to sustain. The town had already done enough for him over the years. He wouldn't ask for more. The hours passed slowly, every minute deepening Ethan's frustration and despair. He combed through old financial records, searching desperately for overlooked funds or forgotten accounts, only to find himself staring helplessly at the harsh truth. He simply didn't have enough. His pride prevented him from reaching out again to Isabel, despite the deep ache in his chest and the painful awareness that she could solve his problems effortlessly. Accepting help from her would feel even worse, like surrendering not only his pride, but his dignity. As evening approached, Ethan leaned heavily against the workbench, gripping its edge until his knuckles turned white. Panic edged dangerously close, a looming storm threatening to swallow him whole. This place had been his father's dream, his own life's purpose, and now it hung by a fragile thread. Suddenly, his eyes landed on the partially restored vintage car tucked away in the corner, a beloved project he'd poured countless hours and heart into, an almost complete masterpiece he'd intended to keep forever as a tribute to his father. His chest tightened painfully, with the realization that selling it might be his only option. The thought was gut-wrenching, yet in that desperate moment, it seemed like his only path forward, a last bitter sacrifice. Swallowing hard, Ethan approached the car slowly, his fingertips tracing its sleek lines gently. His resolve hardened with quiet determination, even as grief rose sharply in his throat. If this was the price he had to pay to save his garage, to save his father's legacy, he'd pay it, no matter how much it hurt. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Ethan steadied himself. He knew what had to be done. Somehow he would find the strength to let go of the past, even if it broke his heart, to secure any chance at a future. The afternoon sun cast a muted glow through the garage's worn windows, highlighting the gleaming paint of Ethan's cherished restoration project. He stood quietly beside the vintage car, eyes heavy with the painful decision he'd finally made. The ache in his chest intensified each time his gaze traced the careful lines and flawless finish of the vehicle. A labor of love, countless late nights, and memories wrapped into metal and chrome. Selling it felt like severing the last real connection to his father, yet Ethan knew he had no choice. He was lost in thought, battling the dread rising in his throat when his phone rang abruptly, breaking the heavy silence. Ethan answered distractedly, expecting another concerned neighbor offering sympathy. Instead, a confident voice filled his ear, polished, professional, unmistakably serious. "Mr. Hayes, my name is Richard Barnes. I understand you have a vintage car for sale. I've been searching everywhere for exactly the model you're offering." Ethan straightened immediately, confusion and cautious hope twisting in his gut. "That's right," he replied carefully. "But I haven't listed it publicly yet. How did you find out?" "Word travels quickly among collectors," the man said smoothly, his voice calm and reassuring, "and I'm prepared to offer you a fair price, well above market value, in fact. I understand you're reluctant to part with something so special, so hopefully this helps soften the loss." Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and suspicion. The generous offer seemed too convenient, yet desperation silenced his doubts. With his garage and livelihood hanging by a thread, he knew better than to question his good fortune. "That's incredibly generous," Ethan admitted, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "I appreciate it more than I can express." "Good," the buyer responded warmly. "My assistant will arrange all the details. I'll have the payment wired today." The call ended quickly, leaving Ethan standing numbly in disbelief. He glanced at the car, gratitude warring fiercely with sadness. Though the transaction felt oddly mysterious, the overwhelming sense of relief eclipsed his skepticism. His father's legacy, the garage he'd fought so hard to preserve, was finally safe. Miles away, in the quiet solitude of her penthouse, Isabel lowered her phone slowly, heart aching deeply despite the weight she'd just lifted from Ethan's shoulders. She'd carefully hidden her identity, made sure the buyer could never be traced back to her, yet guilt still gnawed bitterly at her conscience. The car meant everything to Ethan, and she knew selling it was a sacrifice that would wound him deeply. But if it saved his garage, if it meant keeping his dreams alive, she could bear his pain and her own for just a little longer. Isabel stood quietly, staring out at the sprawling city lights below, knowing Ethan would never guess the truth. She'd given him the help he desperately needed without bruising his pride or dignity, ensuring he'd never suspect her involvement. But even as relief filled her chest, tears burned sharply behind her eyes. She wanted nothing more than to reach out, to offer comfort and reassurance openly, but she knew Ethan wasn't ready yet. For now, Isabel would silently watch from afar, enduring the ache of separation, while holding tight to the hope that someday soon Ethan might understand the depth of her love and forgive her for protecting him in the only way she knew how. Days passed, and Ethan moved mechanically through his routine, forcing himself to find gratitude in his newfound stability, even as he mourned the loss of the beloved car he'd reluctantly sold. The empty corner of the garage where it once stood felt like an open wound, a constant reminder of what he'd sacrificed. Yet he kept reminding himself it was worth it. The garage was safe, his father's legacy preserved. One afternoon, as Ethan sorted through paperwork at his cluttered desk, a neatly dressed courier stepped hesitantly into the garage, carrying a small envelope. Ethan eyed him with confusion, wiping grease from his hands before accepting the delivery. "What's this?" Ethan asked, turning the elegant envelope over carefully. "All I know is it's confidential, from Mr. Richard Barnes," the courier replied simply, nodding politely before slipping out again. Heart pounding with curiosity, Ethan quickly opened the envelope. Inside was a brief typed note and a folded document. His breath caught sharply as he began reading, confusion melting rapidly into disbelief. "Dear Mr. Hayes, though I promised confidentiality, I feel obligated to share the truth. I am indeed an admirer of vintage vehicles, but this particular transaction was arranged through the personal intervention of Isabel Montgomery, who insisted her identity remain anonymous. She explained your situation with genuine concern and compassion, hoping to help you without hurting your pride. I apologize for breaking her trust in sharing this, but it felt important for you to understand her sincerity." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words again, disbelief and realization crashing over him like waves. He reached for the folded document, unfolding it to reveal the transaction details, confirming everything the letter stated. Isabel had orchestrated the entire sale, quietly protecting him from financial ruin at the cost of remaining hidden herself. He sank heavily into the chair, his mind spinning wildly. All this time he'd assumed the worst, that Isabel had been deceptive, manipulative. Yet here in his shaking hands was undeniable proof of her genuine care, her sincere love. The weight of shame and regret pressed heavily on his chest, remembering how harshly he'd treated her when all she'd wanted was to help, to shield him from losing everything. Ethan's heart twisted painfully as he recalled Isabel's pleading eyes, her trembling voice begging him to understand. The clarity of her sacrifice, the depth of her compassion, overwhelmed him. How could he have doubted her so deeply? She'd risked so much. Her pride, her anonymity, simply to ease his suffering. He stared numbly at the empty space where the car once sat, understanding now the real price Isabel had paid. She'd willingly risked their entire relationship to save him from ruin, silently enduring his rejection and anger rather than reveal her quiet generosity. Ethan drew a shaky breath, determination rising urgently within him. Isabel had shown him her true heart through quiet sacrifice. Now it was his turn to reach back, to bridge the painful gap he'd created. He knew what he had to do. He would find her, confront his mistakes, and beg for forgiveness, hoping desperately she would still believe in the fragile bond they'd once nurtured together. Evening had settled gently across the town, street lights flickering warmly. As Ethan stood anxiously outside the modest motel room Isabel had stayed in during their first nights together. His heart pounded unevenly, nerves tightening his chest. He'd spent hours rehearsing what he might say, desperate to find words that would mend the hurt he had caused. Yet, now standing at her door, all the carefully prepared speeches evaporated, leaving only raw vulnerability and genuine remorse. He knocked softly, holding his breath as he heard movement from inside. The door opened slowly, and Isabel appeared, her eyes widening with surprise and uncertainty at the sight of Ethan standing before her, earnest and clearly nervous. "Ethan," Isabel breathed softly, her voice shaking slightly, "what are you doing here?" He met her gaze, swallowing hard as emotion tightened his throat. "I needed to see you, Isabel," he began quietly, his voice thick with sincerity. "I know I hurt you deeply, but I've learned the truth about everything you did for me." She tensed slightly, uncertainty flickering across her delicate features. "Ethan, Please," Ethan whispered softly, stepping closer, desperation and sincerity radiating from him. "Let me finish. Isabel, you saved me, saved my garage, at great cost to yourself. You risked everything just to help me, and I was too blinded by my pride to see your kindness, your love. I'm so sorry." Isabel's eyes filled with tears, her composure fracturing beneath the honesty in his voice. "I was so afraid you'd hate me," she confessed quietly, her voice trembling. "All I wanted was to protect you, Ethan. I never meant to deceive you." He reached out gently, carefully taking her hands in his, warmth passing between them. "I understand now. I was hurt, afraid. I let that blind me to the truth. But I've never stopped caring for you, Isabel, never stopped missing you." Isabel's tears finally spilled over, sliding softly down her cheeks. Ethan raised one hand tenderly, gently brushing them away with his thumb, his eyes holding hers steadily. "Can you forgive me?" Ethan whispered, his voice heavy with vulnerability. "I want a chance to make it right, to show you how much you truly mean to me." Her breath caught sharply as hope flickered across her expression, her gaze searching his face. Slowly, Isabel nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing as she stepped closer, bridging the fragile gap between them. "I've missed you so much," she admitted softly, allowing herself to relax into his embrace, the warmth and comfort she had desperately longed for washing gently over her. Ethan wrapped his arms protectively around her, holding her tight against his chest. Relief surged through him, powerful and healing, dissolving the pain of their separation into something stronger, more resilient. The bond they had nearly lost felt deeper now, fortified by honesty and forgiveness, held securely within the quiet intimacy of their reconciliation. They stood silently, simply holding one another, beneath the soft glow of the hallway lights. Each passing moment affirmed what both had known from the start. Their connection was genuine, enduring, and worth fighting for, no matter the obstacles. Ethan knew now, more clearly than ever, that Isabel was worth everything, and he silently vowed never to let his pride or fear threaten the trust they'd rebuilt. In each other's arms, the past mistakes faded, leaving only the quiet, powerful certainty of their future together. The elegant private dining room was filled with hushed conversations and the quiet clinking of expensive silverware. Isabel sat at the long table, surrounded by her inner circle, family members, business associates, friends, all accustomed to luxury and carefully curated appearances. Her heart pounded steadily beneath her perfectly composed exterior, a familiar mask she'd worn her entire life. But tonight, the mask felt suffocating, and Isabel knew she couldn't maintain it a moment longer. Across from her sat her parents, poised and dignified, unaware of the storm brewing quietly beneath Isabel's calm demeanor. They exchanged polite smiles and discussed business matters, seemingly oblivious to the tension radiating from their daughter. Finally, Isabel took a deep, steadying breath, determination sparking in her eyes. She gently tapped her wineglass, silencing the conversation, as all eyes turned curiously toward her. "I have something important I need to share," Isabel began quietly, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "Recently, I spent time away from everything, away from the business, away from expectations, and discovered something I hadn't realized I'd been missing my entire life." She paused briefly, drawing strength from the thought of Ethan's gentle, genuine smile, the reassuring warmth of his voice, his quiet courage that had inspired her own. "I found someone," Isabel continued firmly, emotion edging into her voice. "His name is Ethan Hayes. He isn't part of this world, but he understands me better than anyone I've ever known. He's humble, sincere, and authentic, and I'm in love with him." Gasps rippled quietly around the table, shocked whispers exchanging between guests as Isabel's parents visibly stiffened. Her father's jaw tightened sharply, disapproval darkening his features, while her mother's carefully maintained smile froze uncomfortably. "Isabel," her father began sternly, clearly displeased, "this isn't appropriate. You can't simply—" Isabel raised a calm hand, silencing him gently but firmly. "No, Father. I'm not asking for permission or approval. I'm telling you because Ethan matters to me, more than wealth, more than reputation, more than anything we've ever valued." Her mother leaned forward slightly, worry softening her carefully poised expression. "Darling, surely you must see how this looks. Your position, our family's reputation—" "None of it matters to me anymore," Isabel replied quietly, meeting their eyes with unwavering conviction. "For the first time in my life, I've found something real, something meaningful. I refuse to hide it." Silence settled heavily over the table, tension crackling in the air. Isabel held her ground, heart pounding fiercely, unwilling to back down. After a long moment, her father exhaled slowly, frustration giving way to quiet resignation. Her mother's expression softened gradually, uncertainty shifting into thoughtful contemplation. Around the table, guests exchanged hesitant glances, unsure how to respond. But Isabel felt lighter, freer than she'd ever known. She had finally shed the burden of secrecy and expectation, stepping boldly into the life she wanted, a life openly shared with Ethan. She stood gracefully, pushing back her chair. "I understand this might be difficult for you all to accept, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come. But please understand, I will not compromise my happiness or my heart any longer." With quiet dignity, Isabel left the room, head held high, leaving stunned silence in her wake. She knew challenges still lay ahead, but she'd made her choice, a bold declaration of love that freed her heart from the chains of expectation. She was ready now, fully prepared to build a future filled with authenticity, truth, and, most importantly, love. Ethan straightened his jacket nervously, standing in front of the imposing estate where Isabel had grown up. Its grand facade was daunting, unlike anything he'd ever faced. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his racing pulse as Isabel took his hand, her touch reassuring. Inside, the vast foyer echoed their footsteps softly, crystal chandeliers glittering overhead, polished marble floors reflecting Ethan's tense reflection back at him. The dining hall doors opened smoothly, revealing Isabel's parents seated regally at an ornate table, their gazes immediately sizing him up with quiet skepticism. "Mother, Father," Isabel began gently, her voice firm but tender, "this is Ethan." Ethan stepped forward, extending a steady hand despite the anxiety tightening his chest. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said sincerely, meeting their cool gazes directly. "Thank you for having me." Her father shook Ethan's hand firmly, eyes assessing him carefully. "Welcome, Ethan. Please sit," he replied curtly, motioning to an empty chair. Dinner began stiffly, the table enveloped by cautious formality. Isabel's father cleared his throat, fixing Ethan with a stern, scrutinizing look. "So, Ethan, tell us about yourself. What do you do?" Ethan took a careful breath, meeting the older man's intense gaze calmly. "I own a small garage. My father built it from nothing, and it's always been my life. It's hard work, not glamorous, but I'm proud of it." Her mother glanced at Isabel with quiet concern, her gaze shifting uneasily between them. "And you feel that's enough? For someone like Isabel?" Ethan paused briefly, sincerity bright in his eyes as he answered honestly, "Maybe I don't have wealth or status, but I promise you, I have integrity, and I truly care for your daughter. I'll always protect her happiness, no matter what." Silence stretched tensely across the table, but Ethan refused to flinch, holding firm beneath their scrutiny. Isabel reached quietly for Ethan's hand beneath the table, offering silent support. Her father's expression slowly softened, revealing something like grudging respect. "You're aware our daughter is accustomed to a certain lifestyle," her father finally said, a subtle challenge underlying his careful tone. Ethan met his gaze evenly, sincerity and determination clear in his voice. "I understand that, sir, but Isabel deserves something money can't buy, someone who genuinely loves and understands her. I want to be that person." Slowly, a faint smile tugged at Isabel's mother's lips, her rigid posture relaxing slightly. "Well spoken, Ethan," she murmured softly, her tone warming gradually. "It's clear you're sincere." Her father remained thoughtfully silent, studying Ethan carefully. Finally, he nodded once, his voice calm yet serious. "I can't deny your character, Ethan. Isabel has never stood so firmly for anyone before. I trust her judgment and yours." Ethan felt quiet relief rush through him, a soft exhale easing the tension from his chest. Isabel squeezed his hand, gratitude and pride shining clearly in her eyes. For the first time, Ethan felt genuinely accepted, not because of wealth or status, but because of his character, sincerity, and the strength of his love. As dinner concluded, Ethan knew he'd crossed an invisible boundary, earning respect he'd once feared impossible. Isabel's family might still have doubts, but they'd seen his true self, and Ethan knew, deep in his heart, he'd proven himself worthy of Isabel's trust and love. The warm, golden hues of sunset streamed softly through the large windows of the Montgomery estate, bathing the elegantly decorated sitting room in gentle, comforting light. Ethan sat quietly, feeling oddly at ease, despite the undeniable tension that lingered beneath the polite conversation. Isabel sat close beside him, her presence a comforting reassurance, her hand intertwined gently with his own. Across from them, Isabel's parents exchanged thoughtful glances, the initial resistance and skepticism slowly melting from their expressions. Her mother leaned forward slightly, studying Ethan closely, with an unexpectedly warm gaze. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice carefully gentle, "I must admit, we initially struggled to understand why Isabel chose someone so different from her upbringing. But now, hearing you speak, seeing how deeply you care for her, it's clear we've misjudged you." Ethan felt surprise and cautious hope flicker within him, his heart quickening slightly. He squeezed Isabel's hand gently, drawing strength from her encouraging smile. Her father cleared his throat, his expression softening into something almost paternal, sincere warmth emerging from his normally stern gaze. "You've shown us tonight that character can't be measured by wealth or status alone," he said slowly, his voice strong yet gentle. "We respect Isabel's choices, but more than that, we see the genuine integrity you've shown. That matters deeply to us." Ethan met his gaze steadily, humility evident in his eyes. "Thank you, sir," he replied earnestly. "All I've ever wanted is to support Isabel, to give her a life filled with love and respect. She deserves nothing less." Isabel's mother reached out gently, placing a warm hand on Ethan's arm, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion. "We can see that now. You've brought something special to our daughter's life, something genuine, sincere, and incredibly rare." A soft, thoughtful silence filled the room, peaceful yet charged with quiet understanding. Isabel glanced at her parents, tears shimmering gently in her eyes, gratitude and relief washing clearly over her delicate features. She'd feared this moment, unsure whether her family could ever look beyond wealth and tradition to embrace Ethan's quiet strength and humble sincerity. But now, witnessing their acceptance, her heart felt lighter, hopeful. Her father rose, stepping closer to Ethan, extending a steady hand. Ethan stood as well, gripping the older man's hand firmly, respect flowing silently between them. "Welcome to the family, Ethan," Isabel's father said simply, the words heavy with sincerity and acceptance. "We look forward to getting to know you better." Ethan felt deep gratitude surge within him, a quiet pride swelling warmly in his chest. Isabel moved gracefully beside him, slipping an arm tenderly around his waist, her touch warm and reassuring. Together they stood united, bridging the once imposing gap between two vastly different worlds. In that gentle moment, beneath the fading sunlight of the elegant sitting room, Ethan knew they had finally crossed the difficult divide that had separated them. Isabel's family saw him clearly, accepting his genuine heart, his sincerity, and the strength of his character, qualities more valuable than any fortune. And Ethan knew, deep in his soul, that he had finally found the place he truly belonged. Morning sunlight gently filled the cozy, renovated home Ethan and Isabel had chosen on the outskirts of town, a space carefully crafted to blend their two very different worlds. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but its simple elegance captured the harmony they'd worked so hard to build. Isabel stood at the kitchen counter, quietly making coffee, the scent drifting warmly through the airy room as Ethan entered behind her, sliding gentle arms around her waist. She leaned back into his comforting embrace, smiling softly as he kissed her shoulder lightly, savoring the quiet intimacy of their routine. Months had passed since they'd committed openly to each other, choosing a path that honored both Isabel's heritage and Ethan's humble roots. Their journey hadn't always been easy, but the challenges they'd faced had only strengthened their bond, reinforcing their commitment to authenticity above all else. After breakfast, Ethan headed out to his restored garage, thriving now, not just because of Isabel's quiet support, but from his own determination and hard work. He moved confidently through the busy workspace, pausing briefly to greet his employees, grateful every day for the pride and dignity he'd regained. Meanwhile, Isabel managed her family's charitable foundation remotely from a modest office they'd set up in the house. Her touch felt in countless communities, her influence quietly powerful, yet never overshadowing the genuine life she'd built with Ethan. She'd learned to blend the demands of her wealthy background with the honest simplicity she'd come to cherish deeply, a perfect balance that felt natural and sincere. That evening, as twilight gently softened the sky, Ethan joined Isabel on their porch overlooking the quiet town they'd both grown to love. They sat together quietly, Isabel resting her head softly on Ethan's shoulder, their fingers intertwined in gentle harmony. "Did you ever imagine we'd find a life like this?" Isabel murmured softly, her voice thoughtful and content. Ethan smiled gently, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Never. Honestly, I didn't think it was possible to bridge worlds as different as ours, but here we are, and it's perfect." Isabel sighed softly, gratitude filling her heart as she reflected on their journey. "You know, Ethan, I've never felt more like myself. With you, I don't have to pretend. I can just be." He shifted slightly, facing her directly, his eyes tenderly searching her face. "And I've never felt more whole. You've shown me how to embrace the life we have without losing myself." Together they watched as lights flickered on in homes across the valley, the peaceful rhythms of the town quietly unfolding below. In that gentle moment, the trials they'd faced, the painful secrets, misunderstandings, and challenges, faded into memories, lessons they'd both grown from. Ethan turned slightly, gently cupping Isabel's face, his voice deeply sincere. "We did this together, Isabel. This life, our life, it's real, genuine, and I promise it'll always stay that way." Isabel leaned into his touch, smiling softly, feeling completely at peace. "True partners," she whispered, warmth filling her voice. As evening settled comfortably around them, Ethan pulled Isabel close, their embrace symbolizing the strength they'd discovered together. Two worlds seamlessly blended, grounded firmly in love, authenticity, and mutual respect. Soft, warm lights cast a gentle glow through the familiar windows of Daisy's diner, illuminating the cozy booths and vintage decor Isabel had once described as charming. Ethan guided her gently inside, a nostalgic smile crossing his lips as he remembered their very first evening here, the cautious glances, nervous laughter, and heartfelt conversations that had sparked something extraordinary between them. Daisy greeted them warmly, her eyes twinkling knowingly as she guided the couple to the same worn booth where they'd first shared their stories. Ethan felt his heart quicken slightly, nerves tightening his chest as he carefully reached into his pocket, fingers brushing gently against the small velvet box he'd kept hidden all evening. Across the table, Isabel smiled softly, completely unaware of the surprise Ethan had carefully planned. She glanced around fondly, her gaze lingering on the simple surroundings that had become so special to them. "Can you believe how far we've come?" she murmured gently, warmth and sincerity brightening her eyes. Ethan leaned forward, taking her hand tenderly, voice deep and sincere. "This place, it brought us together, Isabel. Right here, I realized I was talking to someone who genuinely saw me. Not as a mechanic, not as someone struggling, but just me." Her expression softened further, her gaze tenderly locked onto his. "And it's where I found someone who understood me better than anyone ever had," Isabel whispered, emotion thickening her voice. "Someone who made me believe that love and trust could be real." Taking a slow, steadying breath, Ethan gently slid from his seat, moving carefully onto one knee beside their booth. Isabel's eyes widened slightly in surprise, her breath catching softly as her heart raced. Ethan opened the velvet box slowly, revealing a simple, delicate ring, beautiful in its understated elegance. "Isabel," Ethan began softly, his voice steady and sincere, eyes shining with deep emotion, "our lives began worlds apart, but somehow we found each other right here, in the simplest place imaginable. You've shown me that real love isn't built on wealth or status, it's built on trust, sincerity, and authenticity. You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible." He paused briefly, emotions overwhelming him, as Isabel's eyes filled gently with tears, her heart swelling deeply within her chest. "I promise I'll spend the rest of my life giving you that same love in return," Ethan continued earnestly, voice trembling slightly with heartfelt sincerity. "Will you marry me, Isabel?" For a breathless moment, Isabel stared at him silently, joy and gratitude flooding her entire being. Finally, she reached forward, gently cupping his face, tears of happiness shimmering beautifully in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered warmly, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes, Ethan." I'll marry you." Cheers and soft applause erupted gently around them as Ethan slid the ring tenderly onto Isabel's finger, both smiling warmly through their tears. Daisy herself wiped her eyes, smiling broadly from behind the counter. In the familiar warmth of the diner where their story first began, Ethan and Isabel embraced tightly, the profound simplicity of their love fully celebrated. As they kissed softly beneath the gentle lights, both knew their journey had led to this perfect moment, a testament to a love built not on wealth or status, but on trust, sincerity, and genuine partnership.